First, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Métis Nation of Ontario, excuse me, and also on Lot 2 of the Haldeman Treaty of Six Nations of the Grand River. I would like to begin today by remembering and honoring a young woman from Norway House, First Nation in northern Manitoba, Helen Betty Osborne. Helen Osborne was a 19-year-old Cree woman who had moved to the Pas, Manitoba, so she could attend school. She wanted to be a teacher. On a Saturday evening in November 1971, she was abducted and then sexually assaulted and brutally killed. She was forced into a car by 4 white men who wanted her to party with them. They then drove her to one of their parents' cabins outside of the Pas where she was raped, stabbed, and left dead in the forest. The 4 men returned to the Pas and went their separate ways. Helen Betty Osborne's body was discovered the next day, and the RCMP began its investigation. They first concentrated on a theory that she had been murdered by one of her friends. They investigated her boyfriend. All of their suspects were Aboriginal people. So several months later, they concluded that these 4 white men from the Pas were involved in her murder, but they did not lay charges. And the investigation was stalled for years. So it was not until 1987, so this is 16 years after her murder in 1971, that the RCMP were able to charge 2 men with her killing, and only one of them was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The others were acquitted or had received immunity for their testimony. So why did it take 16 years to bring these men to trial for this brutal act of sexual violence and murder? It had been suggested by many in the Pas that many people knew about this murder even shortly afterwards, but they chose not to do anything about it, so there was this ongoing silence. It has also been suggested that because Osborne was a young Aboriginal woman, many people didn't think that her murder was important. And allegations of racism, neglect, and indifference on the part of the police and the Attorney General were also made. So this outcry from her family and community leaders led to widespread calls for a public inquiry. And in 1991, the provincial government established the Manitoba Justice Inquiry to investigate this troubling relationship between Indigenous peoples and the justice system in Manitoba. The inquiry concluded that Canadian authorities had failed Helen Betty Osborne. It criticized the sloppy and racially biased police investigation that took more than 15 years. But more disturbingly, the inquiry found that the police had been long aware of white men sexually preying on Indigenous women and girls in the Pas, but they did not feel that this practice necessitated any particular vigilance. The inquiry also concluded that, and I'll quote, "There is one fundamental fact. Her murder was a racist and sexist act. Betty Osborne would be alive today had she not been an Aboriginal woman." So, according to a recent Amnesty International report, 1 in 3 Indigenous women in North America is raped during her lifetime. 70% of sexual violence against them is committed by non-natives, and Indigenous women are more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than non-Indigenous women. In Canada, in 2014, the RCMP released their first statistics related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. They identified over 1,000 recorded cases of Indigenous women and girls who had been missing for 30 days or longer, and in all jurisdictions across Canada. So from 1980 to 2012, they had reported cases of 164 missing women and 1,017 homicide victims. And although there's lots of gaps in this data, for example, they didn't always track indigenous identity in the 1980s. This was the first national report that included data from the RCMP and other police jurisdictions. And family and community members, of course, believe this number to be much larger than this. But what do these numbers tell us? I want to quote from Métis Cree filmmaker Christine Walsh's 2006 film Finding Dawn that centers on Dawn Cray, who was a woman who had gone missing from Vancouver's downtown east side, and whose DNA was later found on the Picton farm outside of Vancouver in one of Canada's largest serial murder cases. Christine Walsh says, what is it about numbers? What do they tell us? Do they help us understand? One woman goes missing, then another and another. For a long time, only those who know and love pay attention until the numbers start to add up. So these numbers point to a complex, pervasive, and systemic pattern of violence against Indigenous women and girls. They just begin to track the larger impacts of this issue. They don't count women who have survived sexual violence. They don't include cases that may have been mistreated as accidental deaths. According to the families, these numbers don't quite add up. They aren't just numbers. They are clearly women and girls who have gone missing, who have experienced sexual violence, who were failed by the justice system, and who have been marginalized and sexualized by a history of dispossession of Indigenous lands, territories, and economies. These are women and girls who bear the brunt of colonial policies that tore families and communities apart, including the Indian residential school system throughout the 20th century, and what has been termed the 60s scoop, a policy of removal of children from their families and placement into foster care. These women and children experienced and lived with the gender discrimination of the Indian Act that has also separated women and children from their Indigenous communities. Women like Felicia Solomon, who was a 16-year-old cousin of Helen Betty Osborne, and also from Norway House. In 2003, Felicia had failed to return home from high school in Winnipeg. Her family said that the Winnipeg Police Department did not treat her case seriously when they first reported her missing, and it took the police nearly 3 months to declare her a missing persons case, their theory being that she had run away. In 2003, later that summer, her body parts were found in the Red River that were later identified as Felicia's, and her killer has not been found. We also have cases on Highway 16, dubbed the Highway of Tears in northern British Columbia. And this road is the only link for the 23 First Nations who are along the highway. And with poor public transportation, many young people choose to hitchhike to travel. It's a vast territory in northern British Columbia with lots of roads, clear cuts, and ditches. So the police have listed a number of young women who have gone missing on this road, on the Highway of Tears, between 1969 and I think between 1969 and 2000. So they have 19 cases of missings, but the communities who live along like Itsan and Wet'suwet'en communities and Shimshan communities of northern British Columbia say that the numbers are much higher. 13 of those 19 recorded cases were teenagers, and 10 of the 19 were Indigenous, including 15-year-old Ramona Wilson, who disappeared on her way to her high school graduation in 1995. The police again delayed her investigation, thinking she had run away. Ramona's body was discovered 10 months later in dense forest off the highway near Smithers, British Columbia, and her case is not being solved. So these are just a few of the over 2,000 women and girls. Sexualized representations of Indigenous women and girls have clearly fostered cultural attitudes that have encouraged and accepted violence against them. The Manitoba Justice Inquiry in 1991 said of the murder of Helen Betty Osborne, her attackers seemed to be operating on the assumption that Aboriginal women were promiscuous and open to enticement through alcohol or violence. It is evident that the men who abducted Osborne believed that young Aboriginal women were objects with no human value beyond sexual gratification. So, as you know, on September 1st of this year, a national inquiry on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls began their 2-year work. The commissioners have been mandated to examine and report on the systemic causes behind the violence that Indigenous women and girls experience and their greater vulnerability in our society. The Commission is also directed to report on the impacts of policies and practices of government institutions, including policing, child welfare, the work of coroners, and other historic and contemporary policies. So where did this inquiry come from? It came from the activism and the persistence of Indigenous organizations, such as the Native Women's Association of Canada, whose campaign Sisters in Spirits has been researching and drawing attention to this issue for years. This isn't a new issue. It came from the families and communities of these women who I've talked about today. Families such as Betty Osborne's, Ramona Wilson's, and Dawn Cray's, and the other families of the women who were murdered on the Picton farm in Vancouver. And it also of the family and community of Christine Wood of the Bear Clan First Nation in Manitoba, who has been missing in Winnipeg since August 19th of this year, when her family traveled to the city from the north, traveled south to access health services for their family. So she's been missing since August 19th, when her family has stayed in Winnipeg to search for her. So these are the inquiry came from the insistence and the persistence of these families. As Indigenous activists from the Stalo First Nation, Ernie Cray, the brother of Dawn Cray, has said, stopping gendered violence isn't easy and can't be done alone. The country is riddled with a history of violence. Thank you. So I'd like to, thank you.